The puppy was still breathing when the Marine found her, but only barely. It was 4:52 on a cold November morning in Cedar Falls, Virginia, and the cemetery gates stood black against the fog. Staff Sergeant Caleb Morgan had come before sunrise with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a small bundle of white flowers in the other. He always came early, before the groundskeeper unlocked the side entrance, before families arrived, before anyone could see him standing beside Daniel Hayes's grave with 2 cups and only one voice left to speak. That morning, the sound reached him before the gate did. A faint cry, thin, almost lost beneath the wind moving through the cedar trees. Caleb stopped. The iron bars were wet with dew, and fallen leaves clung to the stone path. At the base of the gate lay an olive-field blanket folded around something small. He set down the flowers and crouched. Inside was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, her sable fur damp and flattened against her ribs. Her ears were still soft. Her paws were cold. She tried to lift her head when Caleb touched the blanket, but the effort ended in a weak shiver. "Easy," he whispered. "I have you." He slid one hand beneath her chest and the other beneath her hind legs, lifting her carefully against the warmth of his jacket. The puppy gave one small sound and pressed her nose into the fabric. Caleb looked down at the blanket. Along one corner, stitched in faded black thread, was a name. Hayes. His breath caught. Daniel had carried blankets like this during field exercises, always marking his gear because he claimed everything disappeared around Marines who could not read labels. Caleb knew the crooked stitching. Daniel had done it himself. He turned toward the cemetery. Fog rested low between the headstones. Nothing moved. Then a shape appeared near the cedar ridge, about 30 feet beyond the gate. A full-grown German Shepherd stood beside Daniel's grave. Female. Thin. Sable coat dark with moisture. Amber eyes fixed on the puppy in Caleb's arms. She did not bark. She did not charge. She simply watched. Caleb rose slowly. The dog's left ear carried a small nick along the edge, and an old leather collar hung loose around her neck. "Is she yours?" he asked, though the question felt foolish the moment it left him. The shepherd took one step forward, then stopped. Caleb lowered himself again and placed the puppy gently on the folded blanket without letting go completely. The mother's body shifted toward them, but her eyes remained on his hands. Caleb moved back 3 feet. She approached with careful steps, nose low, every muscle tense. When she reached the puppy, she touched her muzzle to the tiny head, then looked at Caleb. Not gratitude, not trust, a question. He had seen that look before in places where words meant less than patience. Caleb opened his jacket wider and lifted the puppy again, shielding her from the wind. The mother followed for 2 steps, then abruptly turned toward the northern hill. Caleb thought she was leaving. Instead, she stopped beside a weathered headstone and looked back. He remained still. She moved another 10 feet, paused again, and looked over her shoulder. "You want me to follow?" Caleb said. The shepherd's ears rose. He picked up the flowers, tucked the puppy securely inside his coat, and stepped through the partly open gate. The dog led him past rows of stones silvered by mist, never running, never coming close enough to touch. Each time Caleb slowed, she stopped. Each time he moved, she continued. They reached Daniel's grave. The shepherd stood beside it for one long moment, nose lifted toward the name carved in granite. Then she walked beyond the grave toward the cedar trees. Caleb noticed fresh mud on her paws and dried, leaves tangled in the fur along her belly. She was not leading him away from the puppy. She was leading him toward something else. Behind them, the first light of morning touched the cemetery gate. Ahead, beneath the trees, another weak cry answered from the fog. The second cry came from beyond the cedar ridge, softer than the first and farther downhill. Caleb followed the German Shepherd through wet grass and between rows of older headstones. The puppy pressed securely inside his jacket. The mother moved with purpose, but not speed. Every few yards she stopped and checked him, her amber eyes measuring whether he was still there. The fog thickened near the northern edge of the cemetery, where the maintained paths gave way to uneven ground, exposed roots, and a line of cedar trees that leaned toward the creek. Caleb could smell damp earth, pine bark, and the faint metallic chill of morning. The shepherd slipped between 2 stones and ducked beneath a low branch. Caleb followed carefully. "I am coming," he said. "Just keep showing me." The dog glanced back once, then continued. 2 years earlier, Caleb had promised Daniel Hayes he would come home before the end. He had believed there would be time. Daniel had left the Marines first, returning to Cedar Falls after doctors found the illness that had been draining his strength for months. Caleb remained overseas, telling himself the deployment would end soon, that Daniel would recover, that promises made between friends could survive a little more distance. Daniel called one evening and spoke as though nothing was wrong. He asked about the weather. He complained about hospital coffee. Then, near the end of the call, he said something Caleb had carried ever since. "If I leave anything unfinished, you will know." Caleb laughed then, thinking Daniel meant a fishing boat in his garage or the stack of letters he never answered. 3 weeks later, Caleb learned Daniel was gone. His flight home was delayed, and the funeral ended before he reached Virginia. Since then, he had come to the cemetery before dawn on Sundays, always carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one placed beside the grave until the steam disappeared. He never told anyone. The ritual was not prayer. It was apology. The shepherd led him down a narrow slope behind the oldest section of the cemetery. Her paws were muddy, and dried leaves clung to the fur beneath her belly. Caleb noticed how thin she was. Her ribs showed faintly when she climbed. She should have been weak, yet every step remained careful and deliberate. The puppy inside his jacket stirred and made a small sound. The mother stopped immediately. She turned, approached close enough to sniff the opening of Caleb's coat, then looked toward the trees again. "She is warm," Caleb whispered. "I will not leave her." The dog held his gaze for 1 second longer, then moved on. Beneath the cedars, Caleb found the source of the second cry. A shallow nest had been built between thick roots, covered with branches, dead grass, and pieces of an old canvas bag. Inside were 2 more German Shepherd puppies. One squirmed weakly beneath a layer of leaves. The other lay still against the mother's torn blanket. Caleb knelt, keeping his movements slow. The shepherd moved between him and the nest, her body tense. "I know," he said. "You do not know me yet." He removed his scarf and spread it on the ground. Then he took the puppy from his jacket and placed her beside the others. The mother stepped closer, touched each puppy with her nose, and began licking their faces. Caleb pulled out his telephone. 1 bar of service appeared. He called Dr. Emily Brooks, the veterinarian whose clinic opened before sunrise for farm emergencies. She answered on the second ring. Caleb gave his location and described the puppies. "Keep them together," Emily said. "Block the wind. Do not move the mother unless she lets you." Caleb took off his field jacket and draped it around the nest, leaving space for air. The shepherd watched every movement. Then one of the puppies shifted beneath the leaves and gave a thin cry. The still puppy did not respond. Caleb reached forward, stopping when the mother stiffened. He held his palm open. "You brought me here," he said softly. "Let me help." The shepherd lowered her head and smelled his hand. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she stepped aside. Caleb touched the smallest puppy. Cold. Far too cold. Beneath the canvas bag, his fingers found something hard. He pulled free an old military backpack, damp but intact. A photograph slid from an outer pocket. Daniel Hayes sat on the cemetery wall, smiling beside the same German shepherd when she was young. On the back, written in Daniel's hand, were 5 words. "Her name is Grace. Trust slowly." Caleb read the words twice before looking at the German shepherd beside him. Grace stood over the nest, breathing hard, her eyes moving between the photograph and his face. The picture had been taken years earlier. Daniel looked younger, thinner, and happier than Caleb remembered from their final calls. Grace was still an adolescent then, long-legged and bright-eyed, sitting close enough for her shoulder to touch Daniel's knee. Caleb turned the photograph over again. Beneath the first line, partly hidden by water stains, Daniel had written more. "Do not leave the pups." The smallest puppy remained cold beneath Caleb's hand. He slid the photograph into his shirt pocket and began warming the little body between both palms without lifting it far from Grace. The mother watched, tense but still. "Emily is coming," he said. "We only need to hold on." Grace lowered herself around the other 2 puppies, curling her body against them. The puppy Caleb had found at the gate pressed weakly toward her warmth. Caleb used the field blanket marked Hayes to cover the nest, tucking the edges around the roots to block the wind. The fabric smelled of damp canvas, earth, and something faintly familiar. Cedar soap. Daniel had used the same brand for years. Grace noticed it too. Her nose moved along the stitched name, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Headlights appeared through the trees 15 minutes later. Dr. Emily Brooks came down the slope carrying a medical bag, insulated blankets, and 2 warming packs. She was 34, with dark hair tied beneath a knit cap and the steady movements of someone accustomed to frightened animals and worried people. She stopped several feet away when Grace rose. "Let her see everything," Caleb said. Emily placed each item on the ground slowly. Grace sniffed the air, then looked at Caleb. He opened his hand. "She trusted me enough to move aside once." Emily nodded. "Then you stay close." Together, they worked without rushing. Emily wrapped the smallest puppy in a warm towel and checked its breathing. The second puppy responded when she rubbed its chest gently. The puppy from the gate was weak but alert enough to root toward Grace. 3 girls, Emily said. All cold. One dangerously so. Caleb looked toward the smallest bundle. Can she make it? Emily did not offer comfort she could not promise. She needs warmth, fluids, and time. Grace refused the leash at first. She followed only when Caleb carried the puppies together in a padded crate lined with Daniel's blanket. Each time he moved, she stayed close enough to touch the crate with her nose. At the clinic, the treatment room filled with soft machine sounds and the clean scent of warm towels. Emily placed the puppies beneath a heating unit and started careful fluids. Grace paced the length of the room, watching every hand that came near them. She needs rest too, Emily said, but she will not settle while they are separated. Caleb spread the field blanket on the floor beside the treatment table. Grace stopped. She approached it, sniffed the stitched name, then lowered herself slowly. For the first time since dawn, her head touched the floor. Caleb sat beside her. Through the glass enclosure, the smallest puppy lay almost motionless beneath a towel. The second gave an occasional weak cry. The one from the gate crawled toward the warmth and pressed against her sister. Emily checked the clock. The next hour matters. Caleb rested one hand near Grace's shoulder without touching. Daniel knew you, he said. Grace opened her eyes. And somehow you knew where to find me. Her gaze shifted toward the folded photograph protruding from his pocket. Caleb removed it and held it near the floor. Grace reached forward and touched Daniel's image with her nose. Then she looked at the puppies. A metal tag beneath her old collar caught the light. Caleb had not noticed it outside. He turned it carefully. The engraving was worn, but one name remained clear. Daniel Hayes. Beneath it was a date from 2 years earlier. The same month Daniel had died. Caleb felt the room narrow around that small piece of metal. Grace had not wandered into the cemetery by chance. She had returned to the last place where Daniel's scent, name, and memory still remained. From the warming enclosure came a sudden silence. The second puppy stopped crying. Emily moved quickly to the table. Caleb rose, but Grace was already standing. She pressed her nose against the glass, eyes fixed on the smallest body beneath the towel. Then one tiny paw moved. Emily watched the tiny paw twitch again, then placed 2 fingers lightly against the puppy's chest. She is still with us, she said. The words were quiet, but Caleb felt them move through the room like warmth. Grace remained standing beside the enclosure, her nose nearly touching the glass. Emily adjusted the heating pad and continued the fluids, speaking in short, calm sentences as she worked. Breathing is shallow. Temperature is rising. That is what we need. Caleb lowered himself beside Grace. The shepherd's body trembled from exhaustion, but she refused to lie down. He unfolded Daniel's field blanket and spread it closer to the enclosure. Grace glanced at the stitched name, then back at the puppies. He brought you here once, Caleb said. Now you brought them. Grace stepped onto the blanket, but kept her head raised. The smallest puppy moved again, barely more than a shiver. Then came a sound so faint Caleb almost mistook it for the hum of the warming unit. A thin, broken cry. Grace's ears lifted. Emily stopped for half a second, listening. The puppy cried again. Not strong, not safe yet, but present. Caleb closed his eyes. For 2 years, he had imagined miracles as something large enough to erase regret. This was not that. This was one breath followed by another. One small sound in a room that had been too silent. Grace finally lowered herself onto the blanket. Her legs folded beneath her slowly, and her head came to rest near Caleb's boot. He placed his hand beside her shoulder. This time, she leaned into it. Emily looked over. She trusts you now. Caleb kept his voice low. I think she trusted Daniel first. The metal tag beneath Grace's collar rested against the floor. Caleb lifted it carefully. Daniel's name was clear. Beneath it, the date was followed by a second line almost worn away. Cedar Gate, 6 p.m. Emily glanced at the tag. That sounds like a meeting place. Caleb thought of Daniel's grave, the cemetery gate, and the puppy wrapped in the field blanket. He must have fed her there. Emily nodded. Maybe every day. The idea hurt more than Caleb expected. While he had been away, Daniel had created a small routine no one knew about. Food at the gate, a blanket in winter, a dog waiting among the headstones for the same footsteps every evening. When Daniel stopped coming, Grace had kept returning. Caleb reached for his phone and called Martha Hayes. She answered after several rings, her voice thick with sleep until he said Daniel's name. He explained the cemetery, the German shepherd, the puppies, and the tag. For a long moment, Martha said nothing. Then she whispered, "He used to leave the house at dusk with food in his truck. I thought he was taking it to the shelter." Caleb looked at Grace. Did he ever mention her? Only once. He said there was a dog near the cemetery who did not belong to anyone, but she had chosen him anyway. Martha's breath trembled. He asked me if loyalty could outlive a person. Caleb swallowed. I think he knew the answer. By late morning, all 3 puppies were stable enough to remain under close observation. The smallest still needed help maintaining her temperature, but her breathing had grown more even. Emily labeled the enclosure with temporary names. The first puppy, the one found at the gate, she called Hope. The second became Faith. The smallest, after Grace refused to move until she cried again, became Mercy. Caleb watched the names appear in black marker across the cards. Hope, Faith, Mercy. Grace lay beneath them, finally asleep. Near noon, Martha arrived carrying Daniel's old jacket. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the shepherd. Grace woke at once. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Martha knelt and held out the jacket. Grace crossed the room slowly, pressed her nose into the sleeve, and closed her eyes. Martha placed one hand over the dog's head. "He loved you," she whispered. Grace leaned against her. Caleb turned toward the window, giving them the privacy grief rarely received. Outside, the clouds had begun to lift above Cedar Falls. Inside, 3 small bodies breathed beneath warm light, and a promise no one had heard was beginning to reveal itself. By the next evening, the clinic had grown quiet enough for every small sound to matter. The ticking wall clock, the soft rush of the heating unit, Grace's breathing as she rested beneath the enclosure. Caleb had not gone home. Emily had offered him the narrow couch in her office, but he remained in the treatment room, sitting in a metal chair with Daniel's old jacket folded across his knees. Martha had left after sunset, promising to return in the morning. Before she went, she touched the field blanket and said, "He kept everything that mattered." Caleb had no answer for that. He was beginning to understand that Daniel had left more behind than anyone knew. Hope had improved first. She could lift her head and press toward Grace when Emily allowed the puppies to nurse for short periods. Faith followed, still weak but steady. Mercy remained the smallest and the quietest. Her temperature had risen, then dipped again. Emily checked her often, never rushing, never speaking more hope than the moment could carry. Shortly after midnight, Mercy stopped making sound. Grace noticed before Caleb did. Her head rose from the blanket, and her ears turned toward the enclosure. She stood and walked to the glass. Emily came in from the hallway, saw Grace's posture, and moved to the table. Caleb rose beside her. Mercy was breathing, but slowly. Emily adjusted the warmth and gently repositioned her. "Come on, little one," she murmured. Grace pressed her nose against the glass. Caleb placed Daniel's jacket near the enclosure, letting the familiar scent settle into the room. Grace looked at him, then at the jacket. Caleb unfolded it and laid one sleeve beside her front paws. She lowered herself, but her eyes stayed fixed on Mercy. Minutes passed. The clinic seemed to hold its breath. Caleb remembered Daniel on a cold training night years earlier, sitting beside him under a canvas shelter while rain struck the roof. Daniel had said that fear made people count the wrong things. Miles left, hours gone, chances missed. "Count what is still here," he had told Caleb. "That is how you make it through." Caleb looked at Mercy. One breath, then another. Still here. Grace made a low, gentle sound in her throat. Not a bark, not a cry, something softer, almost like a mother calling from another room. Mercy's paw shifted beneath the towel. Emily leaned closer. The puppy opened her mouth and released a tiny sound. Grace answered immediately. Caleb felt his shoulders drop for the first time all night. Emily continued working, but the tightness in her face eased. "She is responding," she said. "Keep talking to her." Caleb looked at Grace. "You heard her before any of us." Grace did not turn. She kept speaking in those soft, steady sounds, and Mercy's breathing began to match the rhythm. It was not a sudden recovery. Nothing changed all at once. Warmth returned by degrees. A stronger breath. A small movement. A quiet cry. By 2 in the morning, Mercy had settled against her sisters beneath the heating unit. Emily finally stepped back. "She is not out of danger," she said, "but she chose to stay with us tonight." Caleb sat on the floor beside Grace. The shepherd leaned against his shoulder, too tired now to remain guarded. He rested one hand over the worn leather collar and felt the metal tag beneath his fingers. "Daniel said I would know," he whispered. Grace closed her eyes. In the stillness, Caleb understood that the message had never been hidden in a letter or locked inside the backpack. It had been waiting at a cemetery gate, carried by a mother who trusted slowly and refused to leave her young behind. Near dawn, the first pale light entered through the clinic window. Hope stirred. Faith stretched one paw across Mercy's back. Mercy answered with a soft, stubborn sound. Grace lifted her head, and for the first time, her tail moved once against the blanket. Caleb smiled without meaning to. It was a small motion, barely a sound, but sometimes Grace arrived that way, quiet enough to be missed by anyone who had forgotten how to listen. Mercy remained under observation for 3 more days. By the 4th morning, all 3 puppies were strong enough to nurse without help, and Grace had begun eating full meals. She still watched every doorway, but the sharp fear in her eyes had softened. Caleb spent most of those days at the clinic, leaving only to shower, change clothes, and bring back coffee for Emily. Martha came each afternoon with Daniel's jacket folded over one arm. Grace always stood when she entered. Not quickly, not anxiously. She simply crossed the room and pressed her nose into the worn sleeve, breathing in the scent that time had almost taken away. On the 5th day, Emily allowed Grace outside for a short walk. Caleb clipped a leash to the old leather collar, but Grace resisted the moment they reached the parking lot. She did not pull toward the road. She turned toward the cemetery, nearly half a mile away. Her body became still, her amber eyes fixed beyond the line of bare trees. "She wants to go back," Caleb said. Emily looked at the puppies resting safely inside. "Then there may be something she still needs to finish." Martha drove them in her station wagon. Grace sat in the back beside Caleb, watching the familiar streets pass through the window. When they reached the cemetery, she stepped out before Caleb could fully straighten the leash. She did not run. She followed the stone path with the certainty of memory. Past the gate, past the cedar ridge, past the place where the puppies had been found. She stopped at Daniel's grave. The morning was clear, the fog gone, the granite bright beneath pale sunlight. Grace lowered her head and stood there without moving. Caleb remained several feet behind her. Martha came beside him, holding Daniel's jacket against her chest. "He came here every evening," she said. "I know that now." Caleb looked at her. Martha reached into the pocket of the jacket and removed a small envelope, creased and yellowed at the edges. "I found this last night in a box from his apartment." She handed it to Caleb. His name was written across the front in Daniel's uneven handwriting. Caleb did not open it yet. Grace moved closer to the headstone and sat. The metal tag beneath her collar touched the granite with a faint click. Martha covered her mouth with one hand. "He told me there was a shepherd near the cemetery," she said. "He said she would not let anyone close at first. He brought food every day for weeks. Then one evening, she followed him all the way to his truck." Caleb looked at Grace's thin frame, the worn collar, the small notch in her ear. Why did nobody know? His building did not allow dogs. He found an empty caretaker cottage beyond the north fence. He repaired the roof and made a place for her there. He planned to move when he got stronger. Martha's voice faded. He never got the chance. Grace leaned forward and placed her nose against Daniel's name. Caleb finally opened the envelope. Inside was one page. Daniel wrote that Grace had chosen him when he had felt least worth choosing. He wrote that she trusted slowly, loved completely, and waited at the gate every evening at 6. Near the end, the words became less steady. If I cannot come back, please do not let her believe she was forgotten. Caleb stopped reading. The wind moved through the cedars, carrying the smell of damp stone and pine. For 2 years, he had believed Daniel's unfinished promise belonged to the dead. Now he understood it belonged to the living. Grace stood and walked to Caleb. She looked once toward the grave, then sat beside his boots. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket. "You were not forgotten," he said. Grace rested her head against his leg. Martha knelt and touched the dog's shoulder. No one spoke for a long time. Then Grace rose, turned toward the cemetery gate, and began walking. She did not look back. Caleb followed with Martha beside him. Behind them, Daniel's name remained carved in stone. Ahead, 3 puppies waited beneath warm light, and a promise had finally found the person meant to carry it forward. Grace and the puppies left the clinic 1 week later. Hope walked first, unsteady but curious, while Faith stayed close to Emily's shoes and Mercy paused at every new sound. Caleb had prepared his house before bringing them home. He moved the coffee table, covered the hardwood floor with washable rugs, placed 3 small beds near the fireplace, and set Daniel's field blanket beside Grace's larger cushion. The house had been quiet for years. Not peaceful. Quiet in the way an empty room becomes quiet when no one expects laughter to return. That changed before the front door had fully closed. Hope discovered the edge of a rug and began tugging it backward. Faith followed Grace from room to room. Mercy sat beneath Caleb's kitchen chair and watched him with wide, serious eyes. Grace inspected every doorway, every window, and every corner before finally lying down where she could see all 3 puppies. Caleb stood in the middle of the living room, holding 4 new food bowls and wondering when his life had become so full. That first night, he woke shortly after 2 in the morning. The old pressure was back in his chest, the familiar sense that he had missed something important and could not return in time to fix it. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly. Before he could reach for the lamp, he heard soft nails crossing the hallway. Grace appeared in the doorway. She did not climb onto the bed. She sat beside it and rested her head against his knee. Caleb placed one hand between her ears. Neither moved. After several minutes, his breathing steadied. Grace remained until he lay down again. By morning, she was sleeping across the bedroom threshold, facing the hall where the puppies rested. In the following days, Caleb established a routine. Breakfast at 7. Short walks around the block. Medicine for Grace. Weigh-ins for the puppies. Quiet afternoons near the fireplace. Hope gained strength fastest and followed Caleb everywhere. Faith preferred the porch, where she could listen to birds moving through the maple trees. Mercy stayed close to Grace, but each day she wandered a little farther. Martha visited often. She brought an old wooden box filled with photographs, letters, and small things Daniel had kept. One afternoon, she found a picture of Caleb and Daniel standing beside a supply truck, both younger, both smiling into hard sunlight. Grace sniffed the photograph, then settled between them. "Daniel trusted you before he trusted almost anyone," Martha said. Caleb looked toward the puppies. "I was not there when he needed me." Martha folded her hands in her lap. "You are here now." The words did not erase the past. They did something quieter. They gave it somewhere to rest. 2 weeks later, Caleb returned to the cemetery with Grace. This time, they did not go before dawn. They came in full afternoon light, when families placed flowers and the groundskeeper trimmed the grass near the southern wall. Grace walked beside Caleb without hesitation. At Daniel's grave, she sat for a moment, then turned her attention toward the gate. A thin brown dog stood outside the fence, watching from the roadside. Grace rose. Caleb followed her gaze. The dog wore no collar. It looked toward the cemetery, then toward the passing cars, uncertain where it belonged. Caleb felt Grace's leash tighten gently in his hand. Not pulling, asking. He opened the gate and set a bowl of water on the ground. The dog approached one careful step at a time. Grace remained still beside Caleb, calm and watchful. "All right," Caleb whispered. "We see you." That evening, he called Emily and asked what it would take to create a small emergency station near the cemetery entrance. Water, food, blankets, a telephone number. Nothing grand. Just enough for the next animal that waited where no one thought to look. Emily agreed before he finished explaining. Martha offered Daniel's old tool chest for supplies. The groundskeeper offered a sheltered corner beside the gate. Grace sat nearby as they measured the space. Hope slept across Caleb's boot. Faith chased a falling leaf. Mercy curled against Martha's coat. Caleb looked at them and understood that rescue was rarely a single moment. It was a door opened again the next day. A bowl refilled. A promise repeated through action. Daniel had begun something without knowing how far it would travel. Now Caleb was learning that love did not end when one person disappeared. Sometimes it changed hands. Sometimes it grew four paws and waited patiently for someone else to continue. The emergency station was finished before the first hard frost. Caleb built it from cedar boards salvaged from Daniel's old tool shed, sanded smooth and sealed against rain. Martha painted the inside pale blue. Emily stocked the shelves with bottled water, sealed food, clean towels, spare leashes, and a weatherproof card listing the clinic number. The groundskeeper secured it beneath the shelter beside the cemetery gate, where passing drivers could see it without blocking the path. Caleb added one final piece after everyone else stepped away. A narrow metal plate. The words were simple, for anyone still waiting. Grace sat beside him while he tightened the screws. Hope nosed through a pile of wood shavings. Faith watched sparrows along the fence. Mercy slept inside Daniel's folded field blanket near Martha's feet. No one spoke when the sign was finished. The wind moved through the bare branches, carrying the scent of cedar and cold earth. During the weeks that followed, the station became part of the town's routine. A delivery driver refilled the water when it ran low. A high school student left 2 bags of puppy food. Someone placed a clean wool blanket inside without signing a name. Caleb checked the supplies every morning before work and again near sunset. Grace always came with him. She no longer searched the graves for Daniel, but she still paused at the gate, listening. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes that was enough. At home, the puppies changed quickly. Hope grew bold and noisy, greeting every visitor as though she had been waiting all day. Faith became calm and observant, happiest beside the front window. Mercy remained small, but her legs strengthened, and she learned to follow Grace into the yard without tiring. Emily said all 3 would soon be ready for permanent homes. Caleb knew the day was coming. He also knew keeping them together was not the same as loving them well. Martha chose Faith. She said the quiet puppy reminded her of Daniel during the rare moments when he stopped joking and simply listened. A retired Navy corpsman named Walter Green applied to adopt Mercy after meeting her at the clinic. He lived alone on 5 acres outside town and spoke to the puppy with the patient gentleness of someone who understood fragile beginnings. Hope had already chosen Caleb. She slept beneath his desk, carried his socks through the hallway, and cried whenever he took Grace outside without her. On the morning the adoptions became official, Martha brought breakfast to Caleb's house. Emily arrived with paperwork and 3 new collars. Walter came carrying a small red blanket and a bag of treats he pretended he had not researched for 2 weeks. Grace watched each person enter. She inspected every hand, every scent, every movement near her puppies. Caleb expected her to become restless when Faith left with Martha. Instead, Grace walked Faith to the station wagon and touched noses with her through the open door. When Walter lifted Mercy, Grace stood close enough to watch, but did not interfere. Mercy rested her chin on his arm. Walter's eyes filled, though his voice remained steady. "I will bring her by," he promised. Grace looked at him for a long moment, then stepped back. Hope stayed beside Caleb. That evening, the house felt different. Quieter again, but not empty. Faith was across town with Martha, asleep on Daniel's old jacket. Mercy was curled beside Walter's chair near a wood stove. Hope chased her own tail across Caleb's kitchen while Grace watched from the doorway. Caleb opened Daniel's letter and read it once more. "If I cannot come back, please do not let her believe she was forgotten." He folded the page and placed it inside a wooden frame beside the photograph from the backpack. Then he looked at Grace. "You remembered him long enough for both of us," he said. Grace crossed the room and rested her head beneath his hand. The next morning, Caleb found a note inside the emergency station. A family traveling through Cedar Falls had used a leash and blanket to help a frightened dog near the highway. They had taken the animal to Emily's clinic. At the bottom, in hurried handwriting, they had added one sentence. "We would not have known what to do without this." Caleb stood beneath the shelter as morning light reached through the cemetery gate. Grace sat beside him. Hope leaned against her front leg. Behind them rested the names of those who had gone. Ahead, somewhere beyond the road, Another life had reached safety because one small promise had refused to end. 6 months later, sunrise came softly over Cedar Falls, turning the cemetery grass silver and the iron gate gold along its edges. Caleb arrived with Grace walking at his left side and Hope trotting several steps ahead, her ears nearly upright now, her sable coat bright in the morning light. He carried no second cup of coffee. For the first time in 2 years, he did not feel that he was arriving late. The emergency station stood beneath the shelter, weathered slightly by winter but full. Clean blankets rested on the lower shelf. Water bottles lined the back. 2 new leashes hung from brass hooks. Someone had left a small bag of treats beside a handwritten note thanking the people who kept the station open. Caleb checked the latch, replaced one towel, and closed the door. Grace waited near the path to Daniel's grave. She looked toward it, then toward Caleb. He nodded. Together they walked between the rows of stone. Hope bounded through the damp grass before returning to Grace, pressing briefly against her shoulder as though confirming where home was. Martha was already there. Faith sat beside her wearing a blue collar, calm and watchful. A few minutes later, Walter arrived with Mercy wrapped in the red blanket he had brought on adoption day. Mercy was still smaller than her sisters, but she stood steadily now and greeted Grace with a quiet wag. The 3 puppies gathered beneath their mother's lowered head. Grace smelled each one carefully, then stepped back and watched them play around Daniel's headstone. Martha smiled through wet eyes. He would have liked this, she said. Caleb looked at the name carved into the granite. He would have pretended it was all part of a plan. Martha laughed softly. The sound moved through the morning without disturbing anything. Caleb removed Daniel's letter from inside his jacket. He had read it enough times to know every line. He did not leave it at the grave. Instead, he held it for a moment, then folded it and returned it to his pocket. Some words belonged with the living. Grace approached the stone and sat where she had waited through rain, cold, and changing seasons. She lowered her nose to Daniel's name. Then she stood. No hesitation, no backward glance. She walked directly to Caleb and leaned against his leg. He rested a hand on her neck, feeling the old metal tag beneath the leather collar. "Ready?" he asked. Grace looked toward the open gate. Hope was already there, waiting. Faith remained beside Martha. Mercy settled near Walter's boots. Each had found a place where morning meant food, warmth, and a familiar voice. Caleb turned from the grave. The group walked back together, their footsteps soft on the stone path. Near the entrance, a sedan slowed beside the road. A woman stepped out holding a frightened young dog wrapped in a towel. She looked uncertain until she saw the emergency station. Caleb opened the gate wider. Emily's clinic number was printed clearly on the card inside. Martha brought water. Walter offered the spare leash. Grace sat beside the woman, calm and still, while Hope lay down near the young dog without crowding it. No one made a speech. No one needed to. The station worked exactly as Daniel's kindness had worked. One quiet act passed from one set of hands to another. When the woman drove away toward the clinic, Caleb stood beneath the shelter with Grace and Hope beside him. Behind them, the cemetery held its silence. Ahead, the road carried another life toward help. Grace looked once through the gate, not toward the grave, but toward the town waking beyond it. Then she stepped forward. Caleb followed. Hope ran ahead into the sunlight. The iron gate swung closed behind them with a gentle sound. It no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the moment a family finally understood which direction was home.